please. Okay, so we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome.
Good morning.
Welcome to the first day of this training. So thanks for your interest. So before we get into this, I'll introduce Kristen and then tell you a couple of things about some logistics. So Kristen's work focuses on creating intellectual and technical infrastructures for collecting, making accessible, and analyzing both quantitative and qualitative data sets. He prepares complex organizations for the systematic analysis of qualitative data sets by building sustainable, agile, and deeply interconnected research cultures. As an expert for qualitative data analysis software, and methods education, he serves as a consultant for qualitative researchers, research teams, and research institutions. As the qualitative research specialist at the University of Wisconsin Cooperative Extension, he coordinates the creation and maintenance of institutions' central data collection and storage system, and leads the development of the Data Jam initiative, which is an evaluation capacity building framework that utilizes qualitative data analysis software as an institutional backbone for distributed analysis of large qualitative data sets. In the past, Kristen has served as a qualitative research and software specialist at the University of Wisconsin at Madison and at Colgate University, I think in Central New York State, right? So there he has taught qualitative research methods and the use of qualitative data analysis software in multiple academic institutions, both in the US and Germany since 2008. Kristen's recent scholarly interests evolve around the impact of qualitative data analysis software on the production of academic knowledge and on the use and usability of QDA software, which he'll talk about today, as a methods teaching tool. He has published on metaphor theory and analysis, and on cross-language communication and analysis in qualitative research, and also on communication in video games. Kristen holds a Magister AFTM in sociology and in linguistics from Freiburg University in Germany. Kristen is currently a dissertator in the School of Education at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. In his dissertation, he is investigating connections between methodological apprenticeship, methodological knowledge, and the use of qualitative data analysis software. So that's about him. So before he takes on the stage, just a couple of two quick things. So there are sign-in sheets, if you can please sign before you leave. And then there's also a very brief evaluation, just 2 questions. It's all qualitative. So only one question, yes, no, maybe. So it should not take more than a couple of minutes, I think. So if you can do that, then that will be good. So if you are attending only the morning session, you can take the evaluation after that. And if you're staying back for the afternoon and also office hours tomorrow, you can do that whenever you want after you have had more experience. And before that, I'll just want to introduce Keith Taylor. He is co-organizing this effort with me. So for any questions about the training, logistics, anything, he and I are the people to go to. So I am an evaluation specialist, if you already don't know. I'm in the Department of Human Ecology and also with UCANR. And I'll Keith introduce himself.
I'm in the Department of Human Ecology as well. I'm the Community Economic Development Specialist. So if you need any help with some logistics around here, just ask me. But also if you have some work that you're doing in your roles with the EC system around economic development and want to talk about it in your downtime, come and chat with me about that as well.
So thank you, and welcome, Kristen.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Vikram. I'm really excited to be here. I'm also really excited to give this talk about qualitative data analysis software with a door open to the outside. I think it's the first time I do this when the door to a room is open. I'm not really used to doing this when it's not snowy outside, so be a little bit lenient with me. We have 90 minutes today, but I don't want to talk for 90 minutes. In the first half of this talk, I want to provide you with a very rough overview of the value of qualitative analysis methods, and I will discuss quality and qualitative methods. I will then briefly discuss qualitative work in the context of extension work, and I will close with a few hints on justifying qualitative work in the real world. And after this, I want to have some time for questions and discussion. So that's going to be maybe half an hour, and then we're going to have a discussion, and then we're going to go to the next part. In the next part, I'll provide you with an overview over general functions of qualitative data analysis software, some hopes and fears that are connected with qualitative data analysis software, and this will lead up to a broad comparison of two popular qualitative data analysis products, NVivo and MaxQDA. And finally, if time permits, I will show how we use MaxQDA at UW Extension as a platform for building analytic capacity, and how we use it to respond to the data challenge. And then we'll have another chunk of time for discussions. All right. I'm going to start with a little preface. Both qualitative and quantitative methods do certain things very well if they're well applied. And both qualitative and quantitative methods produce meaningless results if they're not well applied. I want to avoid a discussion of qualitative versus quantitative in this talk as much as I can today. I do think that a contrasting discussion of the two traditions is necessary on a methodological level. But I also observe that we often carry out our qualitative versus quant debates, contrasting the best of our camp with the worst of their camp. And I think that is fundamentally a problem when we want to generate a debate how we practically go about our work in the field. Our work does not happen in a social vacuum. It's quite the opposite. Our work as evaluators and researchers is shaped by our social context. The social context determines which methods we apply, how we apply them, what we do with them, and how we further develop our methods. I think that habitual infighting and distancing distracts us from the common struggles that we have in field work. And one of them is, for example, increased time pressure or dwindling resources, just to name a few. So I will try to circumvent the us and them as much as I can, but I also like to invite you to take your social scientists' hats on while I give this presentation. And try to maybe think about not like, well, what is qual versus quant, but think about how does the context of my work support or prohibit work in a certain way, and why is that? So let's think a little bit about the social factors. I will bring them up a little bit, but I don't want to just like put it up front. So what are qualitative analysis methods? Since I don't have like 4 hours for this, I'm gonna do this pretty quick. So qualitative analysis methods are typically designed to help us make sense of language. So I'm making very broad assumptions here. With interview transcripts, you can work with field notes, newspaper articles, policy documents, open-ended interview questions, all these things. Often qualitative evaluators and researchers generate those data through stories and narratives. But qualitative methods are not about storytelling or a means to collect anecdotes. Qualitative methods provide us with strategies and with tools that help us find patterns in stories, patterns in documents, and patterns in observations. So it's all about patterns. Our world is incredibly complex, and the ways we relate to this world are also very complex. And qualitative methods are one approach to deal with this complexity. There are different ways of asking questions. So I want to kind of approach qualitative methods from like a way of, from the perspective of asking and from the perspective of analysis, just to kind of get the whole picture. Tell me what you think about the movie you watched last night. That's a very different question than how would you rate the scariness of this movie, or how do you rate the acting of the main actor. So you often hear that quantitative methods are more objective, that the researcher is not as deeply involved in the research process. But I think that's a misconception. In a quantitative approach, you rely more on what you know already. When you conduct a quantitative survey on the perception of, say, a movie, then you construct what a movie is. Let's say this is a movie. You may ask about how scary the movie was. So you establish scariness as a category that makes a movie. You ask about which actor people like best. So you establish focusing on individuals rather than on ensembles as a category. you prioritize some things over others. So for example, you may not even ask about the lighting in the movie, the way the colors corresponded to the sounds, or how well the movie references 1970s cinema. So you're basically building a frame, you're building a construct, and later you can measure against the construct, which is a great way of working. But you're constructing a standardized experience when you measure. So think of the assumptions that you have to make to create this kind of frame. So what I want to say here is that we always bring in experiences when we do research. In quantitative research, we tend to bring them up front. In qualitative research, we bring them later in the analysis. And so that's also important to think about when you think of qualitative versus quantitative. It's a different approach, a different strategy. And the great thing about working with both is that you can balance back and forth. Yeah, so qualitative research, I think, is not less objective, if you want to even get into the term of objectivity. It's just that you have a little bit more leeway in what kind of questions you ask. You're a little bit more open to see what kind of meanings your participants have, rather than instilling up front what you think is relevant. So the value of qualitative research lies in being able to ask more openly, and asking more openly allows you to see things that you would not see otherwise. So that means you can push your instruments towards being less prescriptive, and maybe even more importantly, your qualitative approaches of data generation can theoretically be seen as less driven by the researcher, because you can curb more of your assumptions during data collection. And I say more, I don't say all. I say more. So now we come to analysis. What other things characterize qualitative analysis? In qualitative research, we look for patterns and for patterns of patterns. That's not germane to qualitative research. It's also true for quantitative research, but we still look for patterns. How do parents decide to keep their kids in the local 4-H club? What are arguments against using cover crops that local farmers have? What are the main impacts of our statewide Master Gardener program? So these are questions you can ask qualitatively. But we're not looking for patterns in numbers. We're looking for patterns in meaning. So let's go back to the movie example. By interviewing moviegoers, we might find that some people felt upset after the movie because it triggered trauma that they had experienced earlier in their lives. For example, war veterans or police personnel may see an action movie very differently than a mountaineer or a waiter. We may find that people who felt the movie was boring tended to not connect its content to their personal lives, versus people who felt the movie was engaging tended to either relate it to their own lives, or they were avid moviegoers who understood all the references to early Russian cinema. So these are things that we can find out through analysis, through listening to the stories that people bring to us, and they're here. We kind of don't know where they are yet. We don't really know what is important yet. So that's one strength of qualitative research and evaluation. Another hallmark of qualitative approaches is that data analysis and data generation are not thought as separate. You might stumble over the term iterativity here and there. So data generation and data analysis go hand in hand. So you may, for example, interview 5 community members, learn something, then conduct a focus group, learn even more, then use the findings from your focus group, go into the community and observe, and there you find maybe 3 more people that you need to talk to, so you do 3 more interviews. So it's an iterative approach, which is different from a quantitative design. And that's one of the advantages that qualitative research can bring, that if you have a developmental approach, if you have something that you want to look at as it goes through its process, and qualitative approaches are really, really powerful because they're designed to be developmental. So far I've spoken about the general lens that qualitative work brings to the table. So we often deal with language, not always, but we often deal with language of some sort. And even if language is our field notes, that consists of language. The qualitative approaches are meant to curb some of our assumptions when we generate data, and they allow us to flexibly adjust our data collection and analysis based on what we learn. So rather than sticking to a system that is set up before we learn something in the field. So what does that mean concretely for evaluation? Let's get a little bit more concrete. There are many benefits of qualitative evaluation, and I want to highlight 3 of them that I think are important for both administrative uses and academic uses and also evaluation uses of data. So one thing we can do with qualitative insights is we can reconstruct personal perspectives and experiences. So I already alluded to that in the movie example. So we don't know how somebody reacts to a movie, what they think about a movie. We don't know what an experience could be for somebody who for the first time goes to a 4-H parent meeting. Yeah, so we don't know because everybody's history is different, and the context that we all bring to every situation makes us interpret that situation differently. And qualitative methods give us entry points to those experiences, and then we can analyze them. Another one is the reconstruction of meaning, to reconstruct the meaning of concepts. So, for example, if you do a survey and you ask folks, what is the biggest, select one of the 5 biggest problems in the community, and they say, maybe one is housing. But then the question is, what does that mean? What does it mean when you crossed housing there? Like, tell me more about this. Or when they say crime, or maybe a short answer in a survey is, there's too much crime. Then we can ask, like, what does that mean? What does it mean when you say crime? Because that can mean all kinds of things. And the power of qualitative methods are in deconstructing and opening up these concepts. What do you mean when you say childhood? What do you mean when you say happiness? What do you mean when you say freedom? All these things, we need to unpack them, otherwise we miscommunicate all the time. And that's why we miscommunicate all the time, because, I mean, probably everyone here has experienced at some point a situation where they said, you don't understand me. Yeah? So in qualitative methods help us unpack things that we otherwise take for granted. Another thing is, and that's all these things are connected, obviously, so we can also find out things that are new and not expected, things we don't know, like with the moviegoers. Like maybe a previous experience of having seen movies from the 1960s and 70s fundamentally changes how somebody watches any kind of movie. Yeah, so and we might maybe make a leap and think that, but we don't know that. So it helps us, qualitative methods help us to really come with a little bit more of an open mind and an open slate to situations and learn what is going on there that we don't know and that we don't expect. So there are these spectrums. I'm going to talk first about the one on top. So there's conceptions and uses of qualitative methods on different spectrums. 2 of them are here where you see flesh on the bones of quantitative data. So that's one way of thinking about qualitative methods. Like it's a way to enhance a different way of knowing. Yeah, or like we have quantitative methods and we can enhance them, embellish them, whatever you want to call that. On the other hand, you can see qualitative research also as a completely different way of knowing. And everything in between, a different way of knowing because we really try to embrace in the analysis and also in the generation of data that we are part of the instruments. We're not trying to separate ourselves out. We're trying to understand that meaning is made as a process between people rather than something that is out there, that is a given, a datum. And so if you think about qualitative evaluation, it has all these different applications. And the question for you as a practitioner is like, in each of the projects, where am I? And later we'll get to the justification part. It's like if your stakeholder is over here, but you're conceptually over here, then you're going to run into issues. You're going to run into misconceptions. You're going to run in differing expectations. And that's, I think, is the biggest challenge for probably any field worker to manage these tensions. Another set of another spectrum Qualitative methods, yes, they can illustrate, yes, you can find good stories. That's one end of the spectrum. On the other hand, you have critique, fundamental critique of a certain situation where like the research becomes more political because of the questions it asks, because how it asks, because who is even asked, and by rejecting maybe existing frames of seeing things. And everything in between, illustration, convincing, exploring, transforming. So there's this large spectrum. And one of the challenges of doing this kind of work is to figure out, where am I, where's my stakeholder, and where does the project need to go? Lastly, qualitative research, and I think that is important for administrative uses of qualitative data, but also for the work that you do as analysts. It creates and maintains commonly shared understanding. So oftentimes in qualitative approaches, we bring back our interpretations to the folks with whom we worked in the field and say, hey, this is what we think, what do you think? So sometimes it's called member checking. There's also ways of engaging the community in co-analyzing data, because it's not as technical, it's not as statistical. But also for you as an organization to contain a commonly shared understanding. So if you as an organization want to know what are impacts in our agriculture institute, the first thing that's important to do that is to have a common understanding of what an impact is. And to connect, to be able not only like what is an impact theoretically, but to have this concept of impact up here and have all the data down here, and to have a common rhizome or like a network of meanings that helps us to go from here to here. So, because qualitative methods are about debating, about making explicit what is otherwise implicit, they are really a powerful means to create organizational language and organizational culture. So far for the benefits of qualitative research. I want to touch on quality really quickly. So what are things that are important when we think about quality? So I think the first thing that is important is reflexivity. So to think about what you do, to think about what you bring to the table. What is my bias? Sometimes it's also called the voice of preoccupation. Everybody has it. The question is, what is it? Yeah. So to think about what am I bringing to the table when I do this research? And that's not only good practice for qualitative research. It is good practice for pretty much everything we do. So this is not to say like, oh yeah, qualitative researchers have figured it out and everybody else hasn't. No, but this is an important part. Reflexivity and being clear and open about the decisions you make. Connected to that, documentation. Did you document your decisions? Did you justify your decisions? Did you revisit questionable decisions? And that's actually one of the things that make qualitative data analysis software so great, is that it has all these built-in tools for documentation. And I'll talk about those later. So reflexivity, documentation, consistency is the third one. Did you analyze and reanalyze all relevant data? Did you cherry pick? Can you justify why you cherry picked? I think that's a really important thing, especially if we deal with lots of data, and if we deal with conceptual understandings of a complex thing that evolve over time. Yeah, so being consistent is important, because that's one of the easiest attacks on qualitative research is, well, you're picking cherries, which is really easy to do and very, very dangerous. So that's one of the standards, to be consistent and to know where the limits of that consistency is. That's a really important hallmark of quality and qualitative research. So a couple of things you can do to do that, a couple of habits are, for example, to always work in groups, to try to always get feedback and to avoid to work alone. One way in which we can kind of modify the issue of subjectivity, of like me kind of pushing myself into the data as a person, is that other people check me, that we work in a group, that people say, no, Christian, you always see metaphors everywhere. Stop it with the metaphors. No, we don't, like, you're reading too much into this because you're obsessed with this part of language. I say, okay, that's good to know, because otherwise I would have just gone and talked about, the water metaphor in 4-H programming, which might have gotten me in trouble. So So it's really important to work as a group, and a lot of folks work alone, and that's really not the way to do it. Because what you're doing when you work when you work in a team is you're creating intersubjectivity, you're creating common understanding that is buffered and not just impacted by what you bring to the table, what you want to analyze. So number one is try to work in group and try to build structures and habits that allow you to work in groups. Get less data, that's the second part, get less data but get more purposeful data. As a research consultant, typically the first thing that I do when I see somebody's interview protocol or survey forms, like cut down half the questions. Ask fewer questions. Like ask only the things you want to really know. And the things you are realistically able to analyze in a purposeful way. Don't get all the data. Like don't do interviews about tell me the story of your life when all you want to know is how was this movie. Like everything's important. And for somebody who's deep involved in like a research topic, of course everything feels important. But do you have time to work on everything that's important? And that's also an ethical consideration. Like don't spend people's time asking them for things that you're not going to look at, or for things that you're going to glance over 5 minutes before you hand in the paper and throw in a quote here and there. Like really be purposeful about getting less data and getting it more purposefully. Third, ask questions that aim at actions, processes, and experiences. This is kind of more like, okay, how do we approach this kind of work? It's like justifications can be good too, but like ask people to talk about the processes and how they see them, what their histories, their experiences. Because that's the rich data, and that's also why it's often tricky to work with like open-ended survey data, because writing is often not like a place where that happens in a generative way. So think about creatively how you can have maybe an open-ended survey, but also get a little bit more depth to kind of flesh on the bones, to kind of do the flesh on the bone strategy. And fourth, do follow-ups and follow-through with stakeholders and participants if possible. And that could even be connected to the first point, working groups. Bring a stakeholder there. Yeah, work with somebody who's part of the arts community of your town. If you're doing a survey about the arts community, like have that knowledge there, have that engagement there, because these perspectives will help you find things that you didn't think of beforehand. So far I talked about methods as if they were disconnected to the social reality around them. And I had asked you earlier to put that hat on for yourself. But I want to now talk in the last couple of minutes before we take a break really quickly about more of the social context. And I want to talk about the roots of extension evaluation. So I'm going to use a quote here. Quote, extension is operating in a new environment, an environment of more open criticism and demands for justification of actions. During the 1970s, as the economy slowed and resources couldn't be stretched to cover demands, an era of increased consumer and taxpayer scrutiny emerged. Quote end. This was published in the Journal of Extension in 1983 by Mary Andrews in the first special issue on extension evaluation. In the late 1970s, the Secretary of Agriculture issued an evaluation of cooperative extension's impacts, which showed a lack of accountability. A few years later, an assessment of the Federal General Accounting Office attested that extensions were not able to demonstrate program results. This sparked the development of evaluation and extension in the beginning of the 1980s. Calls for accountability, calls for justification of what we do, those are the roots of extension evaluation. In her article, Andrews goes on to say that, quote, all funded agencies, not just extension, are vulnerable in these times, quote end. This quote reminds us of what is at the heart of why we do evaluation. Evaluation became a thing because our organization's vulnerability in the face of diminishing resources. This means that we can see evaluation extension partly as a defensive move. A broad turn to what audit culture in higher education affected and affects all academic work, not just extension work. A variety of measuring processes can be subsumed under the umbrella of audit. Student testing, publication impact indicators, internal department rankings, employee evaluations, external university rankings, and also program evaluations. Audit procedures are typically justified by the desire of a normative ideal to enhance efficiency and transparency. Critical scholars posit, often with theoretical reference to Bourdieu and Foucault, that these measures fundamentally change the nature of our work. In our case, the audit procedures may change what kinds of programming we even undertake, because some programs may promise stronger indicators than others. This is basically a variety of teaching to the test. We change what we do so we can create stronger indicators. So coming back to evaluation, audit culture also changes what kinds of questions we ask. For example, we may prefer the question how many over the question how. We may also stop asking certain questions because we cannot boil them down to simple, fast to administer, and fast to analyze surveys. Evaluation is not only about accountability. It can focus on learning, it can create and strengthen relationships, it can help improve the educational work we do. But the origin of evaluation does not lie in exploration, in learning, and in the creation of knowledge. It lies in requirements for accountability, in institutional self-justification, and institutional self-preservation. I think that is an important perspective when we discuss our methods as evaluators, especially when we discuss the value of qualitative research. So why is it so hard to fit in qualitative research in this work? Why is it so hard to justify the effort it takes and the results it delivers? I believe there's an inherent tension between qualitative methods and accountability, because there's a tension between accountability and exploration, between accountability which looks backwards and development which looks forward. Qualitative evaluation and research are hard to do, not only because we deal with complex data, but also because it is hard to carve out and maintain spaces in which this work can meaningfully be done. So now we get to the last question: how to justify qualitative research and qualitative evaluation. Ask your stakeholders why they want an evaluation. Ask them what they're interested in, and then educate them about the benefits of qualitative research. It's a powerful tool to learn. It's a powerful tool when we don't know very much. It's a tool that provides us insights into complex processes and into people's realities of life. One thing I've learned as a qualitative researcher is, if you want to do qualitative work, you always have to be an educator. You always have to educate, because for many folks, quantitative is what they grew up with or what they started with, and there's always a little bit of an educational effort to really show the value. So when somebody asks me, how do I justify this, what I would always answer is educate around it. Like really get down a couple of speeches for 10 minutes of like, this is why this is important, this is why you should care, and this is why we want to do it. And educate, because in the end, a lot of folks are not positivists. It's just something, quantitative research can be something that's just out there. It's a taken for granted, unmarked case of doing research. So we need to educate around what this is and what the benefits of it are. So some of the benefits are, there's not so many upfront assumptions. It's built to be iterative and developmental. There's many ways to integrate qualitative methods into programming because of this developmental approach. And qualitative evaluation and research are a way to make sense of large amounts of text, literature, programming reports, and administrative data. Text is everywhere, and qualitative methods are built to make meaning of text. So that's another, like, if you think about like administrative case for qualitative data literacy, if you deal with text, this is a powerful tool to deal with a lot of text. Okay. We are at time, so I want to invite you to either keep your social sciences hats on or take them off, and let's have a little discussion. Do you have any questions first? First, going to ask about questions. Very qualitative. What do you think? Yes?
I wonder if you want to comment on the mixed methods approach and using not quantum qualitative as separate, but really integrating them, and what value do you think that has?
Yeah. I think there's tremendous value in that. So I personally do feel that the label mixed methods gives kind of like, makes this like a kind of an entity that it maybe is not. So I think using both is awesome. Yeah, but I think the important part of it is to both meaningfully do both where they're strong, and not just kind of like supplement one with the other in an awkward way. So yeah, mixed methods are a great way to really also create iterativity, right? So you can say, we're going to do first a quick survey. Based on what we learned in the survey, we're going to build our questionnaire. Based on what we learned from the interviews, we're going to do a focus group, and then we're going to do another set of surveys. So I think that kind of approach is great. When it comes to analysis, what I would say is it's really important to treat quantitative data as quantitative data and to treat qualitative data as qualitative data. So sometimes the term mixed methods is used to quantify data and quantify qualitative data, and I think that gets problematic. I think there's a space for quantifying data, but to think that the product of qualitative analysis is quantification takes away a lot of power that qualitative analysis has. Does that make sense? Other thoughts? Yeah.
You know, if I followed you correctly earlier, it sounded like you were talking about asking people about, I think, action, processes, and experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit more about the action and processes part of that?
Mm-hmm. So an action could be, you're asking a firefighter, what do you do when the alarm bell rings? So doing questions. Yeah. So questions that are directly tapping into something a person does. Like, for example, rather than if you were a firefighter, although you're not, what do you think would be the most important thing that you should know? Right? I'm just characterizing it. So actions and processes, very similar to that. So that's basically a process, right? So the process of like the alarm bell rings, I get my gear on, then I'm going to check with the others, and we're going to have an assessment sheet that helps us to know where we need to go. Then we go down the chute, and then we make sure that the person next to us is next to us, and then we go. Yeah. So those are actions. Like these are things that, you know. So for example, I could say, okay, that's the process, and I could then ask, okay, so you told me what the process is. Like, well, what do you do? Well, I put my gear on, then I check if I have enough oxygen here. Then I go to the locker and I get my axe out. When I get my axe out, normally I check if Billy has his axe too, because he tends to panic. So when that happens, it happened a couple of times. I remember one time in 1995. So actions, processes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about, you said that a good way to check our assumptions is to work collaboratively in groups, and then of course also to bring back research back to the stakeholders in the community that it came from. So could you talk a little bit more about ways in which you analyzed and collected data in groups, and then ways in which you brought data back to the community for checking?
Mm-hmm. So one example would be, there was a community arts an art community in one of the big cities, I'll say it, in Kenosha. And what they did is they did an open-ended survey that was built with members of that community, of that art community. And then they came back to the central office, and they brought people who were involved in that, and we analyzed the data together. We made sense of the story together, and then that was shared back to them.
So when you say, I guess my question is, when you say we analyzed the data together,
What does that
tell
mean?
me what does that look like in terms of
Yeah.
the doing, the actions and the process?
Yeah, yeah. So perfect. So you're already thinking like a qualitative researcher. So that's actually something that we're gonna do later. So what in the concrete context, what does that mean? So we get together in a room, and we have the data all cleaned up in XQDA. We project the data on a screen that everybody sees. Before the meeting, I talk to the person who's doing this survey, and I say, what are your research questions? What are the questions you want to answer? Then we break them down into smaller questions. Like, okay, so if you want to know how does the community in Kenosha feel about their creative economy, maybe we need to boil this down a little bit. Maybe let's just look at one question that asks about the history of the creative economy. So we're going to work on that. What is the question that we want to answer? So we do that beforehand. Then we get into the room and we start reading the data together. One person reads out the first answer of the first question. And then we say, okay, what do you think they're saying? What do you see here? How does this relate to the question we're asking? Why do you have this reading? Is there another way you could interpret this? Why do you say that? What are some things, some terms that we don't know that they're using that we need to break out further? And then we write that down, we take notes, and then we go to the next piece of data. So we do the analysis together by engaging with the data together. And that's something that you're going to do later on as well. Yeah.
Have there been strategies to ensure representativeness? Because this may be a normative assumption coming from quantitative data where
Yeah.
you need a certain sample size to be statistically significant.
Yes.
And especially when doing mixed methods research, if you have, for example, a survey that is meant to be evaluation and then there's more of the qualitative aspect of that, I'm just wondering how to ensure that whatever qualitative information you have is still meaningful in the sense of it's not just prioritizing certain individual voices.
Yes, yes. So sampling is very, very important. It's just that you're not doing sampling based on statistical measures. You look at, you could for example say, well, we have 4 campuses in which we integrate a new way of doing master gardener education. Well, obviously you want to have all 4 represented. Then you want to maybe say, well, we have coordinators in each 4 of them, and we have volunteers in all 4 of them, and we have folks who the volunteers are teaching. So we want to also make sure that we get maybe at least 1 to start with from each of these campuses. And then there's other things that you may want to consider. Like we want to make sure that we're not only having people who have been in Master Gardener for 25 years, maybe we want to also hear from others. Or you can say, we're going to say in this first round, we're going to only have people that we get, and then we see where the gaps are. And in a half a year, when we do a focus group session, we make sure that we include folks who didn't match the demographics that we had in the first place. So it's really more about like building a complete image over time. But sampling is fundamentally important, yes.
So it's, if I'm understanding correctly, it's still based on like matching certain demographics.
Can be demographics,
Okay.
could also be other things.
And would that be like decided in consultation with the organization that if you're doing an evaluation, what they would consider?
It's a negotiation process. So for example, an organization that says, yeah, we want you to determine this by a binary gender construct, like there's male and female, we want to know what do the females say. You might say, well, first of all, is this really important for you? Is this really something that is significant for your program? And, well, maybe the binary is not the right way to go here. So it's a negotiation process, and it can be demographic, but it can also be things that come out of the research, right? So for example, you do a focus group with farmers, and you realize there are some farmers who are super excited about the new cover crops, but they're hesitant because they see that their neighboring farmers are not doing the same thing. Then there's farmers who are super excited, and they want to try cover crops. And then there's farmers that are not excited at all, but they're excited that their neighbors do it. So you found that out, and you're like, oh, maybe there is something there. Maybe we can kind of find farmers, or make sure that in a qualitative sample that we have farmers of all kinds of varieties. So maybe in your quantitative survey across the state, you would maybe ask certain questions a certain way, so you would construct these categories to then later sample by them. They don't have to be always like, the standard categories. And in fact, for qualitative research, that's one of the important things, is to question these standard categories. To say like, okay, I see that a lot in surveys when folks come to me and ask about, like, I want to get feedback on this survey, and I'm like, is it really important for you to know how old people are? Are you gonna analyze your data by age? Are you gonna do it, or are you just asking it because that's what you think you should be doing? Is gender really important? Are the categories you have meaningful for this? So to kind of like question these pre-made categories is actually part of like the qualitative approach. That doesn't mean that you reject them completely, but you work with them a little bit more consciously. Yeah, one last question, yeah.
I think as a follow-up to the last two questions, I'm wondering from a practical standpoint, if you're working with limited resource communities, how do you incentivize their participation? Because you interviewing them and doing focus groups takes time away from them in other ways.
I think one powerful way to incentivize is to work together. To actually say, you know what, I'm going to work with somebody in the community, and we're going to work together on taking ethnographic field notes in the community. So we're going to go out together, or I'm going to train somebody, work with them to facilitate the group discussion. So you get buy-in because you're using people in the community, you're using knowledge in the community, and you involve the community in the process. It could also be that you're maybe not doing interviews, but you're maybe having something like a ripple effects mapping session, where you ask folks about like what is going really well in the community, and how does this ripple out, or what does not really go well, and how does this ripple out. So make a map together and write post-its together about what goes really well. So to think about these kind of processes that can also be connected with educational interventions, that's a way to get more buy-in.
So you wouldn't necessarily pay them for their time or like compensation in other ways?
It's an option, but it's not always a great option.
I'd like to comment on that.
Sure.
It is not taboo to pay them. Okay, I'll just put that up.
Would you say?
It's not taboo
Okay.
to offer pay, because when you're dealing with limited income people, you know, money matters. But the main thing is that the reason why you're asking these questions and the information that you get from them, they want to know what's in it for me. What will our community get as a result of that? One of the things that we run into is that university come in our community and they ask all their questions, get their data, they go write papers, and we don't hear anything else. So be very clear how it will benefit the community, and involve them.
Yes.
Involve them.
Yes, and to not...
And use their recommendation. Don't just ask them as a matter of formality. You know, use some of their comments.
To not have extractive methodologies, but collaborative methodologies. Yeah, thank you. All right, so we have to move on. So we,
Okay, may I ask a real quick question?
Okay, really quick.
Okay, what about research with having people draw ideas? Would that be considered qualitative, or because it's not
also qualitative. It's like taking it up to 11, I think, analytically, right? So if you think language is hard to decipher, having like a more free-form symbolic language is even harder. But it's something that can be done, and you can have talk alouds. Like that's often done in interview with kids, that they draw things and they then talk about what they drew. So that's it's viable. All right, let's go from drawing to something more technical. So I want to spend the rest of the talk, so we have 40 minutes, on qualitative data analysis software. So one of the abbreviations you will see for this kind of software is CACTUS, which can mean computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software. Can also mean computer-assisted qualitative data analysis. So here we get already to a core problem that one of the usually used acronyms for this denotes both a process and a tool. When I talk about this kind of software, I will always use it as a tool, not as a process. I do not believe that this is a process, although we can have philosophical conversations about this afterwards. So I will use the term qualitative data analysis software, or QDAS. All right, so before I get into the software, I want to give you a broad conceptual overview of what this type of software does before I show you screenshots, because those are going to be scary enough already. I was scared yesterday when I put them in. So, four main functions of qualitative data analysis software are organizing data, annotating data, searching through and retrieving data, and displaying and exporting data. So, organizing data, how does that work? You have your data, and you put it in one space. That's great. Qualitative data analysis software is your hub for all your data that you have. It's awesome because you have everything in one space. It's terrifying because everything is in one space. So they're your home base. Ideally, the qualitative data analysis software is your home base for all your data, for all your memos, for everything that is connected to a project. That's one of the great things about this type of program. You can import text, you can import video, you can import surveys, you can import variables that you can attach to your data. So you can search them later by these variables. And a good software will allow you to have a really broad variety of things you can import. The other thing is annotation. So annotation can go in two different directions. One form of annotation is the reduction of content. Oftentimes that's called coding. Yeah? So we have a chunk of text and we put a small label next to it. That's reduction. That's one form of annotation that you can do in qualitative data analysis software. Put a thing into a box, and you can put another thing into another box. So you're reducing. Another way of annotation is to expand. Here's a piece of data, and I'm going to write something about it. And that's really an important piece here. A lot of folks see qualitative data analysis software as a coding software. It's really a tool that helps you keep track of your thoughts and document your thoughts and think about it as a writing tool and as a metacognitive tool. Side note, coding is also not just putting things in a box. But that discussion, we're going to bracket for now. You can also search through your data. So you can later say, well, everything I coded green, show me. Everything I coded yellow, show me. All the notes that I wrote on something yellow, show me those notes. Show me all the interviews where they talk about their first day at 4-H, but only from participants who are in county A, B, and C, and also only those who expressed earlier in the interview that they really hated the first day of 4-H. So show me only those. Or show me all the answers about how happy they were with the Master Gardener colleague. Okay, rewind. Okay, let's say you do a survey of a Master Gardener conference. You can say, well, show me all the answers of those colleagues who are longer in extension than 10 years, and they are in a rural county. And I want to see what they said about our workshop on expanding access to underserved audiences versus those who have been for 10 years or longer in the institution, but they're in a rural county, so urban rural. Show me those answers so that we can then make sense of them. So then I can write notes about those, and then later I can say, well, show me now only the notes of those interviews. So it's a way to bring your data and your writing together and query it along the way. So organize, put your data in a spot, annotate, expand it or reduce it, search, find things again, whether they are expansions or reductions, and display. In a good qualitative data analysis software, everything that you have in there, you can also get out of there. That's really important because if you work with qualitative data analysis software, that does not mean that you use it for every step. Just because you have a laptop doesn't mean you make a coffee with your laptop. Unless you get one of these great USB plug-in things. But that's a different story. The point is that just because you have a software with a screen doesn't mean you have to do every step on the screen. You maybe also want to do certain steps on paper. I do that a lot when I do qualitative interviews. So I really want to see paper, I want to have pens, and I want to do this. And then later, I need to write this all up. And then I write my memo in qualitative data analysis software. So when you think about yourself as a user, also later in the workshop, think about like what are the things that I really want to do on paper, and what are the things that I really want to do in the software? Because it's really a hybrid process. It's not that you have to use the software for everything just because you have the software. So everything that is in the software typically can also be exported. Another thing you can do is, yeah, you can quantify, which is great, which can be great, which also can be dangerous because it's very, very easy to quantify. You can easily say, well, how many colleagues did not like the food at the MaxQDA workshop, and how many colleagues liked it? It's like, that's great, but that's a quantification. Yeah, and it's very easy to fall into this trap of, oh, I can easily make a chart. I don't have a lot of time, so I've got a product, moving on. Yeah, so there is a little bit of danger in this type of software. Another way of display is that you can make visual networks. So you don't only have like hierarchical coding systems, but you can build network maps of things. So again, you can use it as a thinking tool. We're running a little bit late, so I'm going to skip the next slide here, the next set of slides. And we can talk about these things later. Just to make it short, there's a lot of hopes and a lot of fears around this type of software. Around, do we save time, do we not? Does it distance us from our data, or does it get us closer to our data? Will it change methodology, or does it distort methodology in a bad way? Are we creating more transparency, less transparency? Is it great for teamwork? Is it horrible for teamwork? Yes, no, maybe. The truth is, we don't know enough about it. There's not enough research on qualitative data analysis software for us to know how this stuff really impacts us. So I'm going to leave it at here, and we can later talk about these points if you want to talk about it in discussion. But I want to make sure that we're ending on time. Also, I want to talk about this. Screen size is important. I would even lean out of the window way too far and say, it doesn't matter which software you use. What matters is how your setup is looking, how big your screen is. So this is my laptop and MaxQDA. So I have a little bit of a query access tool here. Here's some results. Here's my data. Look how much data I see. Great. That's really how I really want to analyze my data as if I'm like looking through the rear window of my car. And here's a memo, and that's plopped here. Not helpful. Using laptops and qualitative data analysis software is a terrible idea. On my 14-inch laptop, I have 540 square centimeters. On my 27-inch in my office, I have 2,100 square centimeters. Look how much data I see here. Look how big the query results are here. And the memo is in a comfortable spot. I have two 27-inch monitors in my workspace. I can see one source of data, another source of data, two memos I'm writing. Here's a cross tab of my codes that I can click on to change the query results in 1 second. And here's another memo that I can write here. And that doesn't even count my space that I have on a table. So it's really, really, really important to not judge this type of software by working on it on a laptop, because working on it on a laptop is not fun at all. The whole idea of this software is to create surface. And if you don't have the physical surface, then you're basically robbing the software of its utility. Like the ability to be able to very quickly jump through different passages, like if I want to see in my query results, if I want to see what was said in the interview, I just click on it and it automatically jumps that interview to that passage. Like if I have only one screen, I gotta go use tabs. It doesn't make sense. So really rethink your rig when you think about qualitative data analysis software. Okay, so let's jump in. You don't have to squint. I'm talking conceptually about the software. So there's way too many features and way too many things to be said about the comparison between NVivo and MaxQDA. So I'm going to just talk very broadly, and I'm going to illustrate a couple of things that are really more around the architecture of the software. Because I don't want to do clicking through specific functions. So, first of all, both programs are great. There's no best software really, there's only the software that fits best your needs. So I want to talk a little bit about for which kinds of needs these two programs are typically stronger for. So this is a screenshot from NVivo. I just want to talk a little bit about the general architecture. So here in this first window here, you have different folders, and you can see there's folders and subfolders that can be for your data. So you can have like a folder for interviews, subfolder Wisconsin, subfolder Milwaukee, subfolder Green Bay, and you can organize your interviews here. The same thing for coding trees. You can have like 6 or 7 different coding trees in different folders, and they all pack neatly into these folders that you can easily collapse. When you are in a folder, it shows you the content of the folder here, and you can see the data here in this type of window, and you have little tabs that you can go in between, and you can also take the tabs and put them on different screens. A couple of things that make this strong is that if you have a lot of different data, the folder structure and the ability to have subfolders is a really great organizing tool. So if you have 20 different types of data, you have court documents, you have court transcripts, you have interviews, newspaper articles, you have interviews with law enforcement, you have focus groups with inmates. All these different things are really easy to organize in a system where you have subfolders and stuff like that. One of the caveats here, or not, I shouldn't say caveats, but look how the data are displayed. What you're not seeing is line numbers. So now that is something, like if you need line numbers, that's something that would be missing here. Yeah? So if you do analysis that is focused on like doing line by line analysis where you need to reference the lines, then that's a little bit of a problem. That doesn't mean you can't do it. For everything the software doesn't have right up front, you can find a workaround to make it work. So when you think about which software to use, the question really is, for what do I want a workaround and for what do I not want a workaround? Because in the end, you always have to have a workaround for something. The software is not going to magically know what you want to do or what you should do. You know? So again, we have a good organizational structure here, and we have a display that doesn't have line numbers. And also, one thing you don't have here by default is the coding stripes. You can see coding stripes, so you can see like I coded this with this and that with that, but you can't modify the coding colors as you can in other products. So let's go contrast that. So this is how MaxQA looks like, and again, you can always change screens, but here we have also our folders, and only one layer of subfolders. Here we have our codes, but only one layer of codes. Here we have our data, and here we have our retrieved segments. So having only one layer of documents, that's a little bit more tricky because you can't organize your data by these different document groups. So you have to effectively use variables, document variables that are attached to each of the documents much sooner than you would with NVivo. Yeah, so every software allows you to attach, let's say, demographic information to each of these interviews. You can do this in MaxQA, you can do this in NVivo. And at some point, you always want to cross-cut, right? Just because I have a Green Bay folder, a Milwaukee folder, and a Kenosha folder, like maybe later in my survey, I want to see, like, I want to have the data organized by age. So I have to go back into the variables and do a query based on these variables, and then I can display it. And in MaxQA, you have to use these functions a little bit earlier because you don't have this multi-layered folder system. On the other hand, if you don't want to deal with a multi-layered folder system and set it up front before even knowing what you're going to have folders for, then MaxQA has different strengths. Another thing, just visually, is here you see their coding stripes. That's a little bit over the top, I think, in terms of how many codes there are. Just as an illustration, you can customize your coding colors, and you see very closely connected your coding strips to the data. So MaxQA is really good at visualizing the codes next to the text, and it has a lot of functions to utilize the colors to kind of give you visual representations or also visual cues when you analyze your data. Another thing you see is these memos. You can have memos here at the text level, memos here at the code level, and memos up there at the document level and also at the folder level. And they're represented visually right here. In Vivo, you don't have that. You have memos as actually under quick access. I cannot get up there, but under quick access you see the memos. And Vivo treats memos just as it treats any other document or any other source. So that means you can't just say, I'm going to attach a memo here and I'll see it. What you can do is you can link a piece of data to a memo, a one-way link. Or you can link a piece of data to a piece of a memo. But then you'd have to use the mapping tool to visualize those connections. Yeah, so you don't have that direct visual connection, but you have tools to make it work later on. So similar to the other thing I talked about where you have to use a certain tool earlier on than in the other software, that's true here for NVivo. Another thing is that NVivo, because it treats the memos as texts, that means you can directly code the memos. So you can actually code a memo directly with the codes that you have, versus in MaxQDA, that's not directly possible. You can transform a memo into a document and then you can code it, or you can code an entire memo with a code, but you can't code a small section of a memo with one code and then with another. So those are the kind of details that these two programs have. So now the question is really for you, like, what kind of style of work do I prefer? Yeah, so it's really not about like one is bad and one is good. It's a matter of like how you want to work. One thing in general that I want to say is MaxQDA is easier to learn because all of its functions are basically on one screen. Versus in NVivo, you often have to click through these different sections, which will pop up a different section here, which is kind of like you don't have everything visually on one screen, so that can be a barrier. Also, the visualization of memos and all these things is much stronger in MaxQDA. And also queries are much easier in MaxQDA because you basically only have to click on one of the interviews or one of the folders, click on one of the codes, and you get the retrieved segments here. You don't have to go through like a kind of a wizard that lets you like choose things, and that takes much more time. So that it's much quicker to get retrieved segments. I'm going to quickly talk about this here. Yeah, so this is another like example here where the software is slightly different. It just has a different feel to it. In NVivo, you can create annotations that are basically footnotes. Now that's one way of annotating data. In MaxQDA, you have paraphrases that you can add. So it just looks different, it feels a little different, and you have your memos directly here, right? So it's really a matter of like where you find things and where you want to find things. One thing I want to point out that's I think important from a more like what kind of data do I have and which software is better for the kind of data I have is when it comes to display of large amounts of let's say online surveys or queries or Twitter feeds and stuff like that, because they both display data again a little bit differently. So in NVivo, if you import a survey with short answers, this is how it looks like. It keeps the formness of the form, right? It keeps, like you import a spreadsheet, it stays being a spreadsheet, which is awesome if you have very short answers, and if you want to go through them very quickly. Yeah? But you see, because it's a table, it gets a little problematic if these short answers are not as short, right? And it's not the best way to, like, if all these answers were this long, it would be a little bit less convenient to do the analysis. On the other hand, if this is how you want to do this, then this is great. In MaxQDA, on the other hand, you have, I just blocked this out here, but you have the text of your survey as text, as codable text, and then you have your variables in a different window as variables. So basically, you have a form that folks fill out, it gets transformed in an Excel table, and you remake it into a form, which is a little bit easier for coding, a little bit more convenient for coding. But if you have super short answers, that's not efficient, right? It's easier to see everything in one, like more records on one screen. So again, there's a kind of a little bit of a back and forth. Connected to this are how variables work in NVivo and MaxQDA. So that's really where NVivo, again, has functionalities that are great if you have large amounts of data and very diverse amounts of data. So with large, I don't mean like 100 interviews. You can easily work with that in any software. I'm talking about like very diverse large data sets, like different types of data. Because NVivo has for each different type of data a different set of variables. So I can have a set of variables for my newspaper articles because age and gender is not important for my newspaper articles. It's important for my interviewees. So I have basically a table with my variables for interviewees, a table for my court documents, and so forth. So that's kind of neat because you don't have one gigantic table. In MaxQDA, on the other hand, you have one table that deals with everything. And there are ways to deal with that table in an efficient way, but there are some cutoff points. Like if you have a table with like 250 columns, then it gets a little bit problematic. Then it would be better to have 7 different tables with 20 to 30 attributes or columns each. So those are some things that make the software different. So I want to recap that a little bit. First of all, there's no best software. Second, I think MaxQDA is a little bit easier to learn because it's a little bit more visual. On the other hand, NVivo can deal with more complexity and with greater amounts of variable data. But when I say that, the question is like, what kind of complexity are we talking about? So it's really that's really important for you to know, like, what kind of engagement with the software do I want? Then I would say if you want your surveys to be displayed in a format that's more like a table, NVivo is great. If you want your surveys to be displayed more in a way that looks like a form, then MaxQDA is great. If you really care about the visual representation of your work, MaxQDA is great. If you really want to engage with network maps early on, which MaxQDA has too, but if you want to really build on this kind of networking functionality, then NVivo is great. So to make that decision is really a matter of you trying out the software and trying it on. And of course there are, again, put our social sciences hats on, there's of course institutional barriers, right? So if you, like for example at UW Extension, we run MaxQDA. If you want training, you'll get MaxQDA training. If you want the software for free, you'll get MaxQDA. Because we made a decision, an informed decision, that is the software for us that fills our needs. So that could be for you maybe NVivo, or it could be in your department they use Deduce. So there are always these social aspects as well. The most important thing for you as individuals that I want to encourage you with is try the software out, see how it feels. I can stand here and say, wow, MaxQDA is the best, or NVivo is the best. If it doesn't feel right to you, don't use it. If you're going to use the software and you realize halfway down your project that it doesn't work for you and you're frustrated, and every time frustrated you look at your data, then you shouldn't use the software. Yeah, so try to build, try to figure out ways to test the software, to play with it, get the demo. Most of these programs have demos. Put some data in it, play around. Make an index of your record collection, or plan your next vacation or party in NVivo, and see just what happens and see how it feels, because that's really fundamentally important. Okay, we have 15 minutes, and I'm gonna just for 2 minutes talk about how we use qualitative data analysis software at UW Extension. And then I want to have more time for questions. So, since around 1.5 years, we're using MaxQDA as a tool to capacity build for capacity building in qualitative analysis and evaluation. We do these things that we call data jams. That means we get people together, they have data, they have a question, they analyze data together, and at the end of a day or 2 days or 3 days or 4 days, they come out with a real product, with a thing that they wrote. So what we're doing in this is we're using the software as a focal point. You see here those folks, they sit on their computers, but what they're actually doing is they're looking at all at one screen. We're using the software to create a common view on data, to start having conversations, and what we do is we help them to take notes, to document their work, to ask each other questions, basically to facilitate analysis sessions themselves. And we're using the software because it allows us to have a common tool set. So it's like it's like you're living in an apartment building and your neighbor says, I need some help because I've got 20 people coming and I need to make 300 canapes. If you go to their kitchen, you know where the dishwasher is, you know where the knife drawer is, you know where the spice rack is, you know the kitchen layout because you have the same kitchen at your place. You maybe never make canapes, you only make roasts because that's what you do, but you still are able to work with them because you share the same workbench. And that's the idea behind us using this as a backbone for analysis and for capacity building. The kitchen is the same. Yeah, it's like and you become literate of analysis through seeing how other people have used the tool. It's like when you're seeing a sculpture, a stone sculpture, and you have done masonry yourself, you can see the sculpture, see, that's what they did here, like I can see a little bit of the chisel here, and then they had to glue this on, because you have that same professional vision. Yeah, so we use the software not only as a way to like just deal with data, but having like a workbench that we can share. And I want to leave it at that, and I want to see if we can have some questions and some discussions. Thank you. Yeah, you and then.
I'm super interested in this qualitative data analysis jam session that you mentioned. And so in this example, it would be people like, say, all 4-H leaders or like who are employed, right? They're extension professionals, not community members in this case.
Could be. In this case, what we see here is parts of our civil rights leadership team. So this is actually a multidisciplinary team. They were looking at all the information that in 2016 was put into our recording system where people talked about how they expanded access to underserved audiences. They went together through those to see what kind of trends they see. Over here, we have a team that's led by one of our professors, Stephen Small, in human development, and he works with one of our evaluation specialists here, and with 2 students, one you can't see, I think she might be out at this point, and they were working on interviews that they had collected for a research project. So the audience really is flexible. It's about getting people to the table, getting people with different analytic skills to the table, whether these are community members, stakeholders, people in your own institution, it doesn't matter.
But it's shared software and then shared data. So you're all working with data together.
Yes, and what we do in data jams is that we have a driver, and everybody drives. Yeah, so even if I don't know the software, we're not going to do a click here, click there workshop. Also not later, we're not going to do that. We're going to show you some basic functions, but then you're going to be on your own. The idea is, here Maria, for example, she's been part of data jams from the beginning, and so in this data jam, she was the group leader for this group. Yeah, so she went from like the learner role to the mentor role, and she's driving now. So then the others see, that's how she uses memos. That's how you code. And then after an hour, the computer gets to Steve, and then Steve is running it. Yeah, so everybody gets to run it, and that's actually also important from a dynamic, like a team dynamic standpoint. Especially if you work together closely, you want to make sure that everybody has the ability to drive the software, because if everybody's talking and you're taking notes, then everybody's talking and you don't have the capacity to bring your voice in, so you may become the kind of the computer person who's doing all the menial stuff. At the same time, if you're the only one who drives the software and knows the software, It may be that you're making decisions for the entire team that the entire team can't understand. So if there's a digital divide in your team, that's not good. It can create all kinds of problems. So also, again, that's why we really emphasize that everybody drives. Yeah.
Yeah, following up on that, if you're working with a team, people are in different locations, you can't have this kind of in-person data jam. How does that work? Is it online, and can you comment on people's coding decisions? And
so I think of the data jams as an organizational commitment to get people in the same room and engage. I think doing this kind of work, doing analysis online and like sharing a screen, I mean, that's how I would do it. I would say, I'm going to share my screen now, and maybe I'm going to drive the entire session because it's too complicated to switch around. And everybody shares the screen, and then we analyze together. But that is really only fun if you're already a well-oiled team. It's super frustrating to deal with lags, to look at a screen and not have that engagement, not be able to stretch, not be able to sit back and talk a little bit. Like, I think the social component of doing an analysis together cannot be understated. So the way I think about data jams is like that I'm trying to push the organization to really make that commitment, to say, let's get people together. Yeah? And let's, at least in the beginning, so that we can build a common language and we can build a common rapport. And then you can maybe distribute the analysis out. Then you can maybe say, after we've built a common understanding of like, here are 4 strands of programming, of strategies that we use to expand access to underserved audiences. We've worked on those for 2 days. Now, Maria's going to work on this one. Steve's going to work on this one. We all kind of know how the software works. We know this process. And in 2 weeks, we're going to meet back again. And then we can work online, or we can look at each other's project files, or we can write things up in a Google Doc. But to do it up front, digitally, I think is frustrating, especially if folks don't know the software. Because then you're just watching and you're like, what is going on here? Like, and then there's a lag, and then the lag, what they say doesn't match with what they're doing on screen. I think we have to get better at making virtual spaces before that becomes an option. Yeah.
I am a little curious when you show the image of the data that seems to be overwhelming because everything is there. And of course it would depend on the style and how we focus each other, but to me it seems very easy to get distracted, to see one thing and then go there. And then could you suggest that we should have like a plan, like this question is now. Even if I find all those other things, I'm going to follow the trail for this because we might just jump in an ocean and then at the end of the day it's like, where was I?
Exactly. So when we do full day data jams, the first thing that every group does is they decide on their question and their scope. So we say, okay, either we have a set of questions that they can answer, or we ask them like, what kind of questions do you have for the data? And then we ask them to nail it down to a scope, where they say, okay, in this day, today we're going to look at only programming from urban areas where we reached out to African American audiences, and we're going to only look at what do our colleagues tell us about the program planning. We're going to only look at that section, and the software allows you to just pull these sections up on the screen. If you want to, you can print them out too. And then we say, okay, and our question is, what were things that didn't work and why? So part of the data jam, a really crucial part is like focus down your question. And then when we read the data, one of the important things is you read out loud so that everybody is in the same space. When I see, okay, let's start with the first answer. The food-wise in Milwaukee has for the past year, so I'm going to read every sentence and I'm going to stop at every sentence and we're going to check in on each other. So we're not looking at like a gigantic piece of data and I'm over here, you're picking up something over there. No, it's all about creating a shared experience of the data and then engage in a controlled way with that experience. Is that slow? Yes. But taking it slow in the beginning helps you being able to be faster later. So those would be my tips. And we're going to do a little bit of that later when we work with MaxQDA as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Yep.
Could you speak a little bit about double coding and harmonizing the data? And
Double. You mean double coding across different coders, or do you mean coding data more than with one code?
So two people coding the same data and then harmonizing their coding.
Okay.
And how easily it is made.
Yeah. So teamwork functions are a little bit of a mess. Merging projects is possible in both NVivo and MaxQDA, but it is always a risk, and I always suggest to folks that they do not merge their projects. Merge only projects if you know exactly what you're doing and if you have a clear data analysis plan in place. Otherwise, I always suggest work on one file and take turns. Upload it to a box. Say, I'm going to work on this week, you're going to work on this next week. There are ways of merging files. It can be done, but it's always a little risky because there could be things that can go wrong on a technical end. That's true for both softwares. Important is that both companies use teamwork as a way of selling their data. Oh, teamwork made easier. You have to be very conscious about this term teamwork because the question is always, where does it mean division of labor and where does it mean co-analysis? I think the co-analysis functions in both softwares are great because you have so many opportunities to document. In the division of labor part, if you're really coding in two different places, you later have to merge, you have to do a lot of project management later to see if everything went fine. NVivo has the option to have folks work on the same project at the same time, but again, that is a different module of NVivo, so you have to actually build by NVivo for Teams, which is, I think, NVivo server. So you have to have a server installed on in your institution, and then both have to have a copy of NVivo and connect to that server. So it's possible, but it's not like Google Docs, right? It's not like you're like working together on a document. It's not that kind of real-time experience. So I would say rather than relying on the software for organizing this teamwork, I would say make a solid analysis plan that spaces out the tasks where you bounce back and forth through a project file. Yep.
Following up on the co-analysis question, it seemed that the function in MaxQDA where you can add the memo to each piece of data could be really helpful if you're doing the taking turns part. You know, ideally you get together at first and have a shared understanding, but then somebody goes off and you want somebody else to check your read on it.
Yep.
And then you could add some notes of this is what I'm getting out of this. So have you found that that's another benefit of MaxQDA in terms of how the memo functionality works?
Yes, that's actually I think actually for teamwork, MaxQDA has huge advantages because of its visual presence. So for example, these memos, I could say, I could give that one a color. I could say, this is a blue one. Whenever I write something in this project file, I'm giving it a blue memo. So when you later look at my project file, you scan through the interview or you scan through the data, you see, oh, there's a blue memo. That means Christian made an addition. There's something I need to check. The same is true also for these codings. You see here these little buttons? You can write a comment into this button. So if I'm not sure whether this is X or Y, I write into it, and then this button becomes solid. So you as a PI can either go through it and look at all the ones where I left buttons, and then see if that coding is correct or what you think about the coding, or if there's a problem. Yeah, so I think the visual presence of those features is really helpful for this type of teamwork. It doesn't mean you can't do it in NVivo, it's just looking differently. Okay.
I think we are right on time. Just a quick announcement and a request. The announcement, do you have the...
Yep. Whoa. You see all the stuff you didn't see.
Yeah, so you project this in the afternoon also, so we need to use this to access the computer lab computers. And then we will be meeting in 2213 at 1:30. It's right on the second floor above this one. Yeah, so we'll be meeting in 2213 and then breaking into two rooms. And then the request is if you have not done it yet, please sign in. And if you are not going to come back for the afternoon session, please consider filling out a brief survey, feedback about this session. Yeah.
Will the afternoon session also be relevant for people who are doing NVIVO? Or is it really focused on MaxQDA?
It will, so from the software end, it will only focus on MaxQDA. From the, if you're interested in finding out how you can do teamwork in qualitative data analysis software using this kind of like collaborative approach, then you will benefit from that as well. It's just that we're not going to talk about in vivo. It could be helpful though, because sometimes like looking at a different software gives you also sometimes, because they have these built-in functions, they're like, oh, how would I do this in the other one? Like there are helpful things that you could maybe translate then into your work.
And also, Kristen sent out an email this morning to all of us with instructions to download a data set.
Yeah.
If you are going to work with the instructor provided one. So we can do that in the first
Yeah,
half
we'll
hour.
do that. We'll do that in the first half hour. So if you have a data set, bring your data set. If you don't, we have one. The only thing is, be prepared to work in groups. I would really not want folks to work alone. So if you have a data set and you can share some of that, we'll group up in partners and we can then take turns using each other's data set. All right.
Okay, so we are breaking for 90 minutes. So we'll be back at 1:30, 2 to 1:30.